Picture this: you're 15 years old, torn from your family's arms, and dragged across an empire to serve in what the world calls paradise. Golden chambers, silk robes, and jeweled walls surround you. But here's what they don't tell you about the Sultan's harem. It wasn't paradise. It was a prison wrapped in luxury, where beauty became a death sentence and survival meant forgetting you were ever human. Think the Ottoman Sultan's harem was about romance and luxury? Think again. We're talking about an institution that systematically destroyed the lives of thousands of women across 5 centuries, a machine of human trafficking disguised as imperial splendor. Young girls were transformed into living dolls through psychological torture that would make modern cult programming look like therapy. You're about to discover the nightmare reality behind those golden walls. How children were stolen from Christian families and shipped to Istanbul like cargo. How medical examinations more invasive than anything you can imagine determined who lived and who died. And how a rigid hierarchy turned victims into monsters, pitting desperate women against each other in a fight for basic survival. This isn't some sanitized history lesson. This is the story of systematic sexual slavery that the Ottoman Empire perfected over centuries, where women were sewn into weighted sacks and drowned in the Bosphorus when they displeased their master, and where entire harems of 300 women could be murdered in a single night of imperial madness. The mathematics alone will shock you. Thousands of women competing for the attention of one man, knowing that 99% would die forgotten in those marble corridors. But the real horror wasn't the competition. It was what they had to become to survive it. Before we dive into this historical nightmare, if you're interested in the dark truths that textbooks won't teach you, hit that subscribe button. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's incredible that we can explore these forgotten tragedies together across time and continents, connected by our need to understand humanity's darkest chapters. The acquisition process, a brutal harvest. Let's start with how these girls ended up in the Sultan's collection in the first place. The acquisition process was more systematic and brutal than any human trafficking operation in modern history. The Ottoman Empire didn't just stumble into the harem system. They engineered it with the cold precision of a military campaign. Islamic law prohibited enslaving Muslim women, so the empire turned its predatory gaze toward Christian populations across its borders: Circassians, Georgians, Ukrainians, Greeks, Albanians. These weren't random raids. They were calculated harvests of human beings, specifically targeting the most beautiful girls between the ages of 8 and 14. Here's where it gets truly disturbing. Many Georgian and Caucasian families were encouraged to sell their daughters into slavery, not forced, but encouraged. The promise of luxury and privilege was so seductive that parents would voluntarily destroy their children's lives, believing they were giving them opportunities. Imagine the psychological manipulation required to convince mothers to hand over their daughters to sexual slavery while calling it a blessing. The Crimean slave trade became the primary pipeline feeding the Sultan's appetite for fresh victims. This wasn't some underground black market operation. It was state-sponsored human trafficking on an industrial scale. Crimean Khans would present the most beautiful slaves to the Sultan as gifts, competing to offer him the finest specimens of human misery. The dehumanizing selection process. But here's what most people don't understand about the selection process. It wasn't enough to be beautiful. These children had to survive a medical examination so invasive and dehumanizing that it would be considered torture by today's standards. Young girls were subjected to internal examinations to verify their virginity. They were inspected for physical defects like livestock at auction, their teeth checked, their hair examined, their bodies measured and catalogued. The psychological evaluation was even more twisted. After passing the physical examination, girls were deliberately infested with lice. Ottoman physicians believed that lice wouldn't survive on bodies infected with leprosy, plague, or cholera, so they used parasitic insects as diagnostic tools, forcing children to endure weeks of itching and discomfort while their health was monitored. Sleep monitoring added another layer of cruelty. The girls were watched throughout the night by palace matrons, who documented every sound, every movement, every unconscious behavior. Snoring was considered a sign of mental illness. Talking in sleep suggested psychological instability. Even the way they breathed while unconscious could determine their fate. Identity destruction and psychological conditioning. Those who survived this dehumanizing selection process faced an even worse reality: complete identity destruction. Upon arrival at Topkapi Palace, their birth names were stripped away and replaced with Turkish slave names based on their physical appearance or personality traits. Imagine being 15 years old and having every connection to your former self systematically erased. The conversion process was designed to break their psychological resistance. They were forced to convert to Islam through recitation of Islamic creeds they didn't understand, in languages they couldn't speak. They were forbidden from any contact with their families. Letters were just prohibited. The girls were told their families were dead, that their former lives had never existed. The education system was perhaps the most insidious aspect of this transformation. These weren't schools. They were factories for manufacturing perfect sexual objects. Girls spent 2 years learning Turkish, Arabic, and Persian. They studied the Quran not for spiritual enlightenment, but to demonstrate their complete submission to their new identity. They learned to dance, to play musical instruments, to recite poetry, but every skill was designed to enhance their value as entertainment for one man. The training in what Ottoman records delicately called the erotic arts was comprehensive and degrading. These were children being taught techniques of sexual servitude by women who had been similarly broken decades earlier, survivors teaching new victims how to survive by surrendering their humanity completely. Physical preparation went beyond education. The girls' diets were carefully controlled to maintain optimal weight and complexion. Their exercise regimens were designed to keep them flexible and graceful. Even their bathing routines were supervised and regulated. Every aspect of their physical existence belonged to the Sultan before he ever laid eyes on them. The psychological conditioning during this training period was masterfully cruel. The girls were taught to compete against each other for basic privileges: better food, finer clothes, slightly more comfortable quarters, all dependent on demonstrating superior submission and entertainment value. They learned that kindness was weakness, that friendship was dangerous, that survival required becoming more appealing than the girls sleeping in the bed next to them. A hierarchy of desperation. Here's what makes this system particularly horrifying. Most of these girls would never even meet the Sultan they were being trained to serve. The Ottoman imperial harem could house over 1,000 women at its peak, but the Sultan's attention was limited, his preferences specific. The vast majority would spend their entire lives preparing for encounters that would never happen, aging in luxury that felt increasingly like a tomb. The hierarchy that awaited them was designed to maximize psychological torture through hope and competition. At the bottom were the Adaluk, essentially palace servants, with the theoretical possibility of advancement. Above them, the Gedikli, the Sultan's personal attendants, who might catch his eye during daily service. Higher still, the Iqbal or Gusta, the favorites who had allegedly engaged in sexual relations with the Sultan. At the pinnacle sat the Khadin or Haseki Sultan, the official wives who had borne the Sultan's children. But even this supposed success came with devastating costs. Once a concubine gave birth to a male heir, her sexual relationship with the Sultan typically ended. She would be sent away with her son when he reached an appropriate age, exiled from the palace to serve as his advisor in some distant province. The economic disparity between these levels was staggering and intentional. A valid sultan, the mother of the reigning sultan, might receive 3,000 aspers per day, while a lower-ranking concubine might receive only 40 aspers. This wasn't just about money, it was about creating visible proof that some women's suffering was rewarded, while others remained invisible. But the real currency in the harem wasn't gold or silver, it was attention, and attention was finite. With hundreds or thousands of women competing for recognition from one man, the mathematical impossibility of success created an atmosphere of constant desperation and anxiety that would drive many to madness. A life of waiting and punishment. The daily routine of these forgotten women was structured around preparation for encounters that would never come. They would wake before dawn, spend hours on elaborate beauty routines, dress in their finest clothes, and wait day after day, year after year, decade after decade. Some would wait their entire lives, dying as virgins in silk beds, having never fulfilled the purpose for which they had been stolen from their families. The punishment system within the harem walls reveals the true nature of this supposed paradise. These weren't gentle corrections or minor disciplinary measures. They were a calculated system of terror designed to break human spirit so completely that rebellion became unthinkable. Picture this scenario. You're 20 years old. You've been in the harem for 5 years, and you make eye contact with a eunuch guard for 2 seconds too long. That's your crime. Within hours, you're dragged before the harem aga, the chief black eunuch who controls every aspect of female life in the palace. Your punishment? 50 lashes with a leather whip, followed by 3 days in the punishment cells without food or water. But physical beatings were just the beginning of the horror. The Ottoman system had perfected psychological torture centuries before anyone had a name for it. Women who showed signs of depression or homesickness weren't comforted. They were isolated in the darkest corners of the palace complex, cut off from human contact until their minds began to fracture. The most terrifying punishment was exile to the old palace, known as eski sere. This wasn't retirement, it was a living death sentence. Women sent there were stripped of all possessions, all hope of marriage, all possibility of ever leaving those walls alive. They became ghosts, forgotten by the Sultan, abandoned by the system that had once valued their beauty. Many chose suicide over slow starvation in those forgotten corridors. Self-policing and betrayal. Here's where the system becomes truly demonic. The threat of punishment created a culture where the women policed themselves more brutally than any guard ever could. They became willing participants in their own oppression, reporting each other's smallest infractions to curry favor with their captors. A whispered complaint about the food could be reported as sedition. A tear shed while looking toward the window could be interpreted as escape planning. The surveillance network was so complete that privacy became a luxury more precious than gold. Every conversation was potentially monitored. Every friendship was suspect. Every moment of genuine human emotion had to be hidden behind masks of artificial contentment. The women learned to smile while dying inside, to express gratitude for their captivity, to compete enthusiastically for the attention of the man who had destroyed their lives. Mass executions and imperial madness. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared these women for the ultimate expression of imperial power, mass execution. When Sultan Ibrahim the Mad decided his harem displeased him, he didn't just dismiss or exile them. He ordered all 280 women sewn into weighted sacks and thrown into the Bosphorus to drown. Think about that number for a moment. 280 human beings murdered in a single night because one man was having a psychological episode. These women had committed no crimes, had followed every rule, submitted to every humiliation, performed every degrading act required of them, and their reward was death by drowning in silk-lined sacks, weighted down with stones so their bodies would never surface. The method itself was chosen for its cruelty. Drowning was slow, terrifying, and inevitable. The women would have minutes underwater to contemplate their fate, to understand that their beauty, their compliance, their years of perfect submission meant nothing when faced with imperial madness. The weighted sacks ensured they couldn't swim to safety, couldn't even die quickly. They had to experience every moment of their execution. Historical accounts described the aftermath of these mass drownings. Divers working in the Bosphorus would discover what they called underwater forests of swaying sacks, the bodies inside creating grotesque dancing movements in the current. The image haunted Istanbul for generations, a reminder of what happened when absolute power met human disposability. The eunuch system and psychological manipulation. The psychological impact on surviving concubines was devastating and intentional. Every woman in every harem across the empire knew that story. They understood that their lives could end not because of anything they had done, but because of their master's mood on any given day. This knowledge created a form of trauma so profound that many women lost the ability to form genuine emotional connections with anyone. The eunuch system added another layer of torment to daily life. These castrated men, mutilated as children and raised within the palace walls, wielded absolute power over the women's bodies and daily routines. Unable to express masculinity through normal means, many channeled their psychological trauma into creative cruelties against the women they supervised. The black eunuchs controlled access to everything: food, bathing facilities, communication with other women, even permission to use the latrines. They could deny these basic human needs as punishment or grant them as rewards. The most sadistic among them would force women to beg for water during summer heat, or deny them warm clothing during Istanbul's brutal winters. The physical examinations conducted by eunuchs went far beyond medical necessity. Women could be subjected to invasive inspections at any time, ostensibly to check for contraband or signs of illness, but these examinations were often exercises in humiliation, designed to remind the women that their bodies belonged entirely to the imperial system. Some eunuchs developed elaborate systems of psychological manipulation, promising advancement to higher positions within the harem hierarchy in exchange for sexual favors they couldn't physically consummate. Women would degrade themselves in increasingly desperate ways, only to discover that the promises were lies designed purely to extract entertainment from their desperation. The most disturbing aspect of eunuch control was their role in preparing women for the Sultan's attention. When a concubine was selected for an imperial encounter, eunuchs would bathe her, dress her, apply her makeup, and position her body according to the Sultan's preferences. These men, psychologically damaged by their own mutilation, became the architects of other people's sexual exploitation. Competition and survival. The competition between concubines reached levels of viciousness that would shock modern audiences. These weren't catty disagreements or minor jealousies. We're talking about systematic campaigns of destruction where women would poison rivals, spread false accusations of witchcraft, or arrange for competitors to be caught violating palace rules. The pregnancy wars were particularly brutal. A woman who became pregnant with the Sultan's child gained enormous advantages, but also became a target for every other concubine in the harem. Mysterious miscarriages were common, often the result of carefully administered herbal concoctions that would terminate pregnancies without leaving obvious evidence of murder. Successful mothers faced their own horrors. The Ottoman succession system meant that princes were potential threats to each other. A mother might spend years protecting her son from assassination attempts orchestrated by other concubines, seeking to eliminate competition for the throne. These women became generals in wars fought with poison, manipulation, and strategic alliances that could shift overnight. Isolation and despair. The isolation from the outside world was so complete that many women lost touch with reality itself. They created elaborate fantasy lives where they imagined their families were searching for them, where rescue was imminent, where their suffering had meaning. Some developed multiple personalities to cope with the contradictions of their existence. Others retreated so far into their minds that they became functionally catatonic. The most heartbreaking cases were the women who survived long enough to age out of the system. Beauty was their only currency, and time was their enemy. Watching younger, more attractive women arrive, while knowing their own value was diminishing, created a form of psychological torture that many couldn't endure. Some chose suicide rather than face the slow descent into irrelevance and eventual exile to the old palace.